Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to talk about the first large human settlements in the world, and we'll talk about the first cities in the world. We'll talk about what conditions had to arise in order to lead to the development of large settlements and then cities. We'll talk about things like the Neolithic Revolution, humans embracing agriculture, which leads to resource surpluses, which allows for larger population centers. And then we'll talk about other intellectual developments and technologies that allow for the creation of true cities, according to scholar V. Gordon Childe. And we'll go over V. Gordon Childe had 10 parameters that a settlement or community had to have to be considered a city. We'll go over those parameters. They're useful parameters, but they do have some limits. And I'll give an example of the limitations of Childe's parameters. But I think Childe's parameters are still going to be useful to us in this course. After this, we'll talk about some of the first cities in Mesopotamia, emerging in the 3000s BCE. We'll talk about Uruk, and we'll also talk about as well. We'll talk about the Sumerian people of Mesopotamia. We'll talk about their architecture, their life and their culture based on archaeological finds we found, written languages they developed, their religious beliefs, some of their cultural innovations. And then we'll talk about what happens to the Sumerian culture and how it's basically taken over by another culture called the Akkadian culture. Then we'll talk about another ancient civilization that develops cities. And basically there are three sort of ancient civilizations attached to three different kind of river valleys where the first cities emerge. Mesopotamia, which we talked about in this video, ancient Egypt and the Nile River Valley, which will be the subject of our next video, and then the Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan. And in the Indus River Valley civilization, we'll focus on the city of Mohenjo-daro. We'll talk about their architecture, life and culture in Mohenjo-daro, and we'll discuss some of the similarities and differences between Mohenjo-daro and the Indus Valley civilization and the Mesopotamian civilization. In order to better understand ancient Greek and ancient Roman cities, we have to discuss the origins of cities, and specifically how cities developed from the first sedentary agricultural settlements that emerged in the ancient Near East, roughly 11 to 12,000 years ago. This map shows the two important regions in the ancient Near East that we're going to be discussing throughout this video. Anatolia, including part of what is now Turkey, as well as Mesopotamia, including what is now Iraq, as well as parts of the Levant as well. Specifically, within these two regions, we're going to discuss the settlement of Jericho and the settlement of Çatalhöyük. Jericho was in Mesopotamia, in the Levantine region, and Çatalhöyük was in Anatolia. Before moving forward, I wanted to give a couple of comments about the dates that I'm going to be using in this lecture and throughout the course. First, I want to say that students of all faiths, spiritualities, and beliefs are welcome in this course. The dates presented in this course, however, may not line up with those presented by some religious texts. This course is not trying to invalidate the contents of these religious texts or the beliefs of the students enrolled in this course. Regarding dates, this course will present the academic consensus arrived at through a variety of relative and absolute dating methods, all of which have limitations. We discussed some of those limitations in a previous lecture. As such, not all scholars agree on these dates, and these dates may be changed in light of new discoveries. What I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to force any one specific belief on any student. I'm merely presenting what scholars and scientists have found so far. And their findings may change in the future based on new discoveries. As we begin this video, I want to go into more detail about V. Gordon Childs' 10 criteria for ancient cities. V. Gordon Childs was mentioned in a previous video, but we'll go over his 10 parameters for what a city is here. And he developed these parameters in 1950. His first requirement is concentrations of a relatively large number of people in a restrictive area. That is a requirement for having a city. But not all settlements that have a large number of people can be considered cities. And you'll see that a little bit later in this video. 2, developed social stratification. Large population, developed social stratification. There has to be basically classes of people, and not everybody can be living at the same level. It's not an egalitarian settlement. It has to have social stratification to be considered a city. Third requirement, although most citizens are going to be farmers in some way, some will be able to pursue non-agricultural occupations, craft specialists, priests, traders, administrators, soldiers, etc. And this is caused by resource surpluses. And that's actually the fourth parameter, the production of an economic surplus and its appropriation by a central authority, such as a king or deity. There has to be not just social stratification, division of labor, resource surpluses. This economic surplus has to be at least controlled in part by a central authority, like a king or a god or perhaps a priestly class who basically are the rulers of the city. There must also be writing or written language. Writing would have developed to record economic activity, business transactions mostly in the beginning, but over time, as these cities get more sophisticated, they'll use writing to record things like myths, historical events, ideological issues, in order to justify the discrepancies between the privileged and the lower classes. Basically, Child said that you don't just use writing for business, you also use it to create myths, religious tales, tales about how, say, your king is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and that's why he is the king and why you have to obey him. In addition to writing, there has to be exact and predictive science to forecast the weather for agricultural production. Now, just because you have predictive science doesn't mean that you're always accurate or that your scientific inquiry is as sophisticated as scientific inquiry is today. But there has to at least be an attempt to study the world, usually for agricultural purposes, but for other reasons as well. 7, monumental public architecture, which will include structures like temples, palaces, fortifications, and tombs. These buildings, they have to not just be built. A small little temple, a small fence, small wall may not count as being truly monumental. It has to be fairly large, and it has to be a public communal project built together by the people for the protection or for the use of the city. In addition to monumental public architecture, you'll also see figural art. Non-urban societies can create art too, but in order to be an urban center, you have to make figural art along with all of these other requirements. Number 9, foreign trade, trading with people beyond your city, not being isolated. That's very important. And you'll see evidence of foreign trade in many societies, but it's a requirement according to V. Gordon Childs if you want to have a community be considered a city. And the last requirement or parameter is residence-based group membership, in which people of all classes, both rich and poor, can share in a sense of community. The rich and the poor may not always get along in the city, but they recognize they're all residents of the city, and they share a common identity tied to that city. And those, of course, those common identities tied to cities, they will evolve into regional cultures, like the Sumerian culture. It evolves out of the cultures of the early Mesopotamian cities. And as I've suggested before, there are some limitations to Child's criteria for ancient cities.
you could say that it kind of privileges cities in the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. There are very large communities with a very large populations that don't meet all 10 of these requirements, and they're not considered cities. These are communities that are outside of what is called the Mediterranean Near Eastern core. And I'll give an example in a moment on a later slide of a very large community that does not meet all 10 of these requirements, and according to Child would not be considered a city. But I still think that Child's criteria on the whole is useful, and it will be referenced periodically throughout this course.
While Jericho and Çatalhöyük cannot be considered cities by the criteria we listed previously, they were civilizations. What does it mean to be living in a civilization? Rather, what does it mean to be civilized? When most people hear the term civilized or civilization, they think of a very advanced state of living, a state of living that includes significant amounts of technology. Someone might say, after a long trip in the wilderness, returning home, "Thank goodness I've returned to civilization." They may even say this after something as simple as losing cell phone service. "I've come back to civilization now that I have cellular service." Scholars and scientists, however, have a slightly different definition of civilization. They define civilization as the state or condition of being civilized, human cultural, social, and intellectual development that is considered to be of advanced or of a progressive nature. In other words, there must be technological development, and it must be advancing at a significant rate. A settlement cannot be considered a civilization if it is stagnant. The settlements of Jericho and Çatalhöyük, while not possessing all of Child's requirements for cities, certainly possessed the requirements to be considered civilizations, as there was advancing cultural, social, and intellectual development in these centers. I will give evidence of that advancement in the subsequent slides. On another note, I want to discuss the materials used to build these settlements. These settlements were usually built from mud and straw bricks. These bricks are highly decomposable. They break apart over time as a result of the weather and human use. As these buildings would disintegrate, new ones would be built on top of the ruins, creating artificial hills, which we call tells or höyüks. I mentioned tells and höyüks briefly in a previous video. The breakdown of these buildings will also create layers of strata, which can be investigated by archaeologists. Since we've talked about the definition of civilization, or what civilizations are, I want to briefly go back to Child's definition of cities and explain some limitations of Child's definition or his parameters of what a city is. And I want to give one of several examples. So Child's 10 parameters can be quite useful, but they do have their limitations. I generally think they fit a lot better with the civilizations of the Mediterranean core, that is the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. The further you get away from the Mediterranean Near Eastern region, the harder it is to use Child's parameters, because you find some very large settlements, what one scholar called super towns outside of the Mediterranean region, that are very large, but they don't meet all 10 of Child's criteria, so therefore they're not considered cities. And a good example of a supertown culture, a supertown civilization, you might say, that were very sophisticated as a people, but that did not have cities by Child's reckoning, are the Cucuteni Tripilia settlements. And this culture existed in Central Eastern Europe, roughly what is now the Ukraine, in parts of Romania and Moldova, and their settlements are much older than Uruk. For example, Maidenets, the site shown in this slide, was probably founded perhaps about 5000 BCE and had become a very large supertown by 4000 BCE. Uruk, of course, was not really founded until about 3200 BCE. And there were points when settlements like Maidenets were much larger than Uruk. But Uruk is considered to be a city because it fits all 10 of Child's parameters for what a city is, but Maidenets does not fit that definition of what a city is. The people that lived at Maidenets did not have a written language the way the people of Uruk did. There's not social stratification at Maidenets. It seems to actually be a very egalitarian society, whereas Uruk and other Mesopotamian cities were very socially stratified. There's no evident central authority at sites like Maidenets, but there is evident central authority at Uruk and other Mesopotamian sites. Therefore, they're considered to be cities. And we don't have evidence of things like predictive sciences at Maidenets because we don't have a written language for the people of Maidenets. We don't have any evidence that they had a written language. They are what are called prehistoric societies. Prehistoric, in terms of archaeology, is used to refer to societies that do not have a written language. And it's also debatable whether Maidenets truly has monumental architecture. They do have some fortifications, as you can see from this slide, but they're not especially impressive walls. And there are some small temples in Maidenets, but they're very small compared to the temples and ziggurats of Mesopotamia. So they don't have all 10 of Child's parameters for a city. And therefore, even though they're very large, they're not considered to be a city. But just because they're not considered to be a city does not mean that they're not a civilization. There is division of labor, and there is things like art and culture being produced. An example of that culture is the goddess figurine, and this is a small figurine. It's about 7 inches tall. It's meant to represent a goddess of some kind, we think. We don't know for sure because we don't have a written language for this culture. But basically, people would say that Child's definition of cities, it really works well for the Mediterranean core, and it works well for the Near East and sort of adjacent regions like the Indus River Valley. But it doesn't really work as well once you get away from that kind of Mediterranean Near Eastern religion. Northern Europe, Maidenets, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture is not considered to be an urban culture. There's even settlements in the Americas that were founded, settlements founded in what is now Peru at about the same time as Uruk in Mesopotamia, but because they don't have all 10 of Child's 10 parameters, they're not considered to be cities. So there are some limitations with Child's definition of an urban center, but I still think it's useful and we'll reference it throughout this course. But now we'll continue our discussion of the first settlements in the ancient Near East, and we'll talk a bit about agriculture. Before beginning our discussion of Jericho and Çatalhöyük, we should briefly outline why the humans of the ancient Near East adopted sedentary agriculture. Scientists and scholars believe that the Neolithic agricultural revolution occurred around the year 10,000 BCE, 12,000 years ago, or about 1,000 years before Jericho emerged as a settlement. They think that a change in the world climate as a result of the end of the last great ice age made the ancient Near East far wetter and more humid than it is today. The inhabitants of the ancient Near East would have noticed an abundance of grasses and flora that could be eaten. Over time, these people would have selectively bred these plants to create the grains and vegetables that we know today. Examples include barley, lentils, and wheat. These people also would have domesticated animals, starting with smaller animals like sheep, and eventually working their way up to larger creatures like cattle. These animals provided meat, dairy products, skins and wool, and power as beasts of burden. By the way, horses would not be brought to the ancient Near East until about 2500 BCE. Horses are native to Central Asia, much further to the north. Adoption of agriculture and animal husbandry would have provided more food security than a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. It also would have allowed for the increased division of labor thanks to resource surpluses, as an entire community would not have to be involved in food acquisition and production. Some members of that community could become artisans or administrators or warriors. At the same time, in gaining extra security, people transitioning from hunter-gatherer to sedentary agricultural life would have also lost many freedoms, as social hierarchies and governments emerged to manage the resource surpluses. People had to submit to the hegemony of their rulers, and they had to prepare for warfare against other settlements that wanted to seize their resources. While rapid starvation was less likely in sedentary agricultural societies, there is evidence that people in agricultural societies suffer from other maladies. Everyday people often suffer from malnutrition due to their unbalanced grain-based diet. Physically inactive rulers who ate more varied diets instead dealt with diseases like gout, caused by excessive meat consumption. The settlement of Jericho was first established roughly around 9000 BCE, and the area has been continuously inhabited by humans ever since. Here's a reconstructed overlay of what the settlement of Jericho would have looked like. As you can see, there's modern agricultural fields all across the site. You will also notice the settlement of Jericho had multiple levels, and it also contained walls as well. These multiple levels reflect the multiple tells, or layers of strata, once again highlighting the site's continuous human occupation. The settlement was probably destroyed and rebuilt many times, as noted by religious stories. The walls, shown in this reconstruction, were most likely built for defense, but they may have also been built for flood control as well, to protect the settlement from being washed away by the nearby Jordan River. As you can see, the houses were detached from one another. Initially, they were round in shape, but gradually were replaced by quadrangles, demonstrating increased architectural sophistication, a core sign of civilization. Residents of Jericho also made artwork and practiced basic metallurgy, although they still relied mostly on stone tools. Some domiciles were larger and more ornate than others, suggesting a degree of social stratification, and that this settlement would have had rulers of some kind. One of the elements of Child's parameters for cities. Jericho, however, is still too small to be considered a city. As such, it is a civilization and a large settlement, but not truly a city. Here are some reconstructions of what the walls of Jericho may have looked like. As you can see, these walls were designed primarily to keep out enemy military forces. The residents of Jericho may have also dug moats around the walls. These moats probably did not contain water most of the year due to the climate's aridity, but they would have made scaling the walls more difficult. Now we can talk a little bit more about the buildings of Jericho and how they were used by Jericho's residents. The houses of Jericho were built closely together, but they became more sophisticated with time. The materials the people of Jericho used included mud brick, roofs made of palm fronds and thatch, as well as paints and pigments like whitewash to make their houses colorful. The people of Jericho also would have kept food in their homes, including grains they had harvested, as well as their livestock, primarily sheep and goats. Swine and cattle would not be domesticated until later. Keeping their food and their livestock in the settlement would have kept these valuable items safe from theft. The settlement of Jericho was founded without pottery and metallurgy, although these technologies would be adopted later. Because of the resource surpluses the people of Jericho experienced, they had time to dedicate towards artwork, like some of the figures shown in this slide. These are figures the people of Jericho made to represent themselves. They also collected the skulls of the dead, decorated them with seashells, and kept them in the floors of their home. The seashells showed that Jericho, an inland city, had trade networks with the coast. The Jericho residents may have also decorated the bones of the deceased as a form of ancestor worship and to signify ownership on the lands which they practiced agriculture. This is a common trend we see in many early agricultural societies as they worked to justify their ownership of land and their agricultural activities. The Jericho residents' attitude towards human remains stand in stark contrast to how the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome viewed human remains thousands of years later. Greco-Roman people believed that dead bodies should be kept away from living spaces. They should either be cremated or buried in cemeteries and necropolises separated from where people lived. Now let's discuss Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük was inhabited from roughly 6500 to 5500 BCE. Unlike Jericho, the settlement of Çatalhöyük was eventually abandoned. Çatalhöyük was built in a geographically diverse region near plains, river valleys, and mountains, all of which would have offered a variety of resources to Çatalhöyük's residents. Some scholars think that the residents of Çatalhöyük may have been the first people to domesticate cattle. The people of Çatalhöyük had resource surpluses, giving them a chance to make art, woven cloth, and jewelry. Like the residents of Jericho, they also placed the bones of the dead in their homes, possibly for the same reasons of ancestor worship and signifying their ownership of the land on which the settlement was built. The people of Çatalhöyük used a variety of materials in their artwork, suggesting they had extensive trade routes. They used seashells from the Mediterranean, and they used minerals from the Sinai Peninsula. In their artwork, the residents of Çatalhöyük also practiced basic metallurgy, but like the residents of Jericho, they still relied primarily on stone tools. Unlike the residents of Jericho, the people of Çatalhöyük built their homes attached to one another. They would enter their homes through the roof. Their houses were not separated like those in Jericho. Also, unlike Jericho, Çatalhöyük did not possess walls. The architecture of Çatalhöyük actually bears some similarities to the Pueblo style of architecture used by the indigenous people of the North American Southwest. For some reason, the settlement of Çatalhöyük was abandoned around the year 5500 BCE. Scientists and scholars do not agree exactly on why the settlement was abandoned, although some think that a natural disaster, possibly a volcano, may have caused the citizens of Çatalhöyük to abandon their homes. Here is an image of daily life in Çatalhöyük. As you can see, the residents of the settlement enter their homes through holes in the roof, and they traverse the roofs using ladders. You can see the similarity between Çatalhöyük's architecture and the architecture used by some Native American peoples in the North American Southwest. Like the people of Jericho, the residents of Çatalhöyük decorated their homes with art. They used white plaster and red paint to make their homes look especially vibrant. On the right is a recreation of what a home in Çatalhöyük would have looked like when it was inhabited. As you can see, there's artwork on the wall, there's a cow skin on this bench, and there's even horns on the wall, suggesting that the residents of this home may have worshipped cattle, since cattle were an important part of their livelihoods. Scholars think that the image depicted on this wall, and again on the left side of this slide, is a volcano erupting, a clue to why the settlement may have been abandoned. Now that we've discussed some of the early agricultural settlements, Jericho and Çatalhöyük, we can discuss the development of the first cities in the ancient Near East. The first cities emerged on the eastern end of the Fertile Crescent, in the Tigris-Euphrates River valleys, in what is now the country of Iraq. We're going to focus on the city of Uruk, one of the most important of these cities. Life in the southeastern portion of the Fertile Crescent was very different than life in Çatalhöyük or in Jericho. The southeastern Tigris and Euphrates River valleys are very flat and marshy. They don't receive very much rain or precipitation, but there is plenty of groundwater. The people in these regions would have had to work together to practice agriculture. They would have had to have built canals to water their fields and to control flooding. The people working together would have also been able to build cities. The people of the southeast Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia came together to build the first cities in the world. These people would eventually be known as the Sumerians, although they probably called themselves the black-haired or black-headed people. We're going to focus on one of the most important cities they built, called Uruk. In their cities, the Sumerians built monumental public structures, especially temples and palaces, and government buildings atop the tells. These tells would grow taller with time as old buildings collapsed and new buildings replaced them. In the center of this image, you can see a couple of tells around the city site of Uruk. Scholars and scientists think that these tells, with temples on top, evolved into the ziggurats constructed by later Mesopotamian civilizations like the Babylonians, with whom the ancient Greeks came into contact. These expanding temples may also have been the basis for religious stories like the Tower of Babel. On the right of this slide is a reconstruction of the White Temple, a religious edifice where the Sumerians of Uruk worshipped the sky god Anu. On the left of this slide is a piece of the pediment of the temple of Inanna, the daughter of Anu. Inanna was the goddess of fertility, sex, and warfare. Quite a combination. Inanna may have inspired future deities like the goddess Ishtar of the Babylonians and the goddesses Artemis and Aphrodite of the Greeks. The Sumerian cities were ruled independently, much like the city-states we would see in the Greek civilization millennia later. Each of these cities was ruled by a king. The kings were ambassadors between the gods and the people. The kings claimed that they ruled on behalf of the gods to justify their hegemony. The kings would have collected resources from the countryside. Some of these resources would be given to the priests. The rest of the resources would be used to support administrators, the military, and artisans. Here is an image of the mask of a woman. Some think it's a mask of Inanna. Here is the Uruk vase, depicting Sumerian people bringing agricultural produce, namely livestock, to their kings and priests. Now that we've discussed the government and religious authorities of Uruk, we can discuss daily life for everyday residents of Uruk. Everyday Sumerians would bring goods to the king and his priests. They would also dig canals, which could be traversed using boats. Women in Sumerian society wore wraparound robes, and they kept their hair long. Men also wore long hair and kept square beards. But men wore cloth kilts. They kept their chests bare. Priests, like seen in this left image, who were usually male as well, also wore kilts, but they shaved their heads and faces to distinguish themselves from secular men. Here are some modern artists' recreations of how the Sumerians may have looked as they went about their daily lives. The Sumerians frequently wore jewelry, highlighting their culture's full adoption of metallurgy, of gold and silver and copper primarily. Priests, shown at left, kept records of goods donated to the gods and given to the king, giving a rise to the administrative branch of the Uruk government. Now we can discuss some of the Sumerians' technological innovations. As mentioned on a previous slide, the Sumerians practiced extensive writing, something that Jericho and Çatalhöyük did not do. They developed a written language called cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped. Cuneiform was a writing language that contained both pictograms, similar to hieroglyphics, as well as syllabic symbols. But the cuneiform writing system would become more syllabic over time. Cuneiform evolved from recordings used to keep track of resources. Most cuneiform that we have found as archaeologists was written on clay tablets and was not meant to be saved. They're usually records of resources, shopping lists, things of this nature. Literary works would not be written until later. Some cuneiform tablets would also describe historical or religious themes, and these were meant to be preserved, but they were not large-scale literary works. The Sumerians also developed the wheel, which allowed goods to be more easily transported to the cities. Pottery wheels also allowed ceramics, used primarily for food storage, to be made far more cheaply and easily as well. In addition to developing the world's first monumental architecture, the temples built on tells, the Sumerians also developed the corbel arch, seen here, made from mud bricks. This is an example from the entrance of the tombs of Ur. Here are some diagrams that illustrate the evolution of cuneiform, as well as the development of the corbel arch. As you can see on the left, the cuneiform writing system evolved from pictographs, becoming more wedge-shaped over time. You can also see the corbel arch and its differences with a true arch developed by later cultures, but perfected by the Romans. The corbel arch's top bricks are parallel with the ground, as seen here. Whereas a true arch, its bricks are circular. Unlike the Jericho and Çatalhöyük residents, the Sumerians exhibited elements of social stratification in their burial rituals. If you remember, the people of Jericho and Çatalhöyük placed the remains of their dead in their homes. The Sumerians, however, built elaborate tombs for their wealthy people. These tombs were built in specialized complexes and cemeteries, usually outside of the cities. The Sumerians' choice to build large tombs, as seen at sites of the tombs of shown here, reflect the stratified values of Sumerian society. The Sumerians believed their kings needed possessions for use in the afterlife, suggesting that they believed, one, in a life after death, and two, that a deceased person could bring possessions with them into the afterlife. The Sumerians also practiced human sacrifice, killing and burying soldiers and servants in these tombs, suggesting that the kings would need service and protection even in death. It is unclear whether these sacrificial victims went to their deaths willingly, hoping to serve their king, or by force.
Now that we've considered life and death in the Sumerian city-states, I want to talk about what causes the Sumerian civilization to come to an end. Basically, the Sumerian city-states, they will lose their independence about the year 2350 BCE after being conquered by Sargon I, king of Akkad. Akkad was a nearby Mesopotamian city-state. And as Sargon captured and took over other Mesopotamian city-states, he created the Akkadian Empire, which is considered to be the world's first empire. An empire is basically a power that rules over multiple people groups, and it extends its authority or its hegemony over a large stretch of territory. Sargon of Akkad was ruling over multiple peoples in the form of the multiple city-states that he ruled, and the Akkadian Empire extended across a large amount of territory, encompassing most of the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, and extending really all the way to the Persian Gulf. And this image is of a king from Mesopotamia. It's believed to be Sargon of Akkad, or perhaps one of his descendants. Sadly, though, this piece has been lost. It was lost during some museum lootings that occurred in 2003 in Iraq. Anyway, Sargon's military effectiveness may have come from his adoption of new weapons technology, namely basically a type of composite bow and arrow, a much more powerful bow and arrow than was used by other Mesopotamian city-states. And certainly a more powerful bow and arrow would have given his soldiers better range, allowing them to more easily strike at their enemies. They also may have had better, stronger, more sophisticated bronze weapons than the other Mesopotamian city-states. This image here, known as the Standard of Ur, shows what the military of the city of Ur would have looked like. The Standard of Ur is from before Sargon's takeover, but I think it's fairly illustrative of some of the weapons that other city-states would have used. You can see these war wagons, sort of proto-chariots. They're not really chariots because they have 2 axles and 4 wheels. A true chariot has only 2 wheels. Also, these are not spoke wheels. These are solid wheels. They're much heavier. These war wagons would have been a lot slower than a chariot, the chariots that we think of today, that were used by later ancient civilizations. True chariots are invented, we think, by steppe people from what is now either southern Russia or Kazakhstan. Basically Indo-European people. They were invented about the year 2000 BCE. So Sargon's invasion precedes the invention of true chariots by a couple hundred years. It's possible, though, that Sargon may have used war wagons like this on his side, but perhaps he had them pulled by horses instead of donkeys. You can see in the Ur standard, these war wagons are pulled by donkeys. They have very long ears, not the kind of ears that horses would have. Now, horses had been domesticated for perhaps about 1,000 years by this point, and Mesopotamian peoples were aware of horses, but it seems that they primarily used donkeys and oxen as their draft animals. You don't see a lot of horses in Mesopotamia until much later. So it's possible that Sargon had some horses brought in from the steppes to the north, and he used them to pull his own war wagons. And of course, donkeys are very strong, but they're not as fast as horses are. So he certainly had better bows and arrows and better weapons, and he may have had better animals, better draft animals like horses. This is just speculation, though. Either way, though, the Akkadian Empire is built by taking over the formerly independent Mesopotamian city-states. And by the time of Sargon of Akkad, Uruk was no longer the most prominent Sumerian city, but it was a very enduring site. This urban center was inhabited long after the Akkadian Empire had faded away, and Uruk was only actually destroyed in the year 700 CE, so basically in the early medieval period. People were still living in what was left of Uruk. And the exploits of King Sargon, the building of the Akkadian Empire, it may have inspired fictional stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh that were written by later Mesopotamian people. So this is the Sumerian and Mesopotamian peoples. They're one of the trinity of 3 civilizations that were the first to develop cities. The Mesopotamians that we've talked about here, the Egyptians of the Nile River Valley, who will be the subject of a future video, and then the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the Indus River Valley civilization. The final subject we'll discuss in this video will be the Indus River Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization. We don't know what these people called themselves, though, because we have not deciphered their written language. Harappan, it comes from the term Harappa, which is the name of one of their largest settlements. We're not really going to talk about Harappa as much in this video. We're going to talk about a different site known as Mohenjo-daro, which is generally seen as being the most famous of all of the Indus River Valley civilizations. So the Indus River Valley civilization is centered on a river valley, just like the Nile River Valley civilization of Egypt and the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley civilization of Mesopotamia. This is in what is now Pakistan. This region was also a part of India in the past. So Indian and Pakistani people will have an interest in this site. They will see themselves as stakeholders of Harappan Indus Valley sites. The star on this map here shows the rough location of Mohenjo-daro. And basically, the Indus River Valley has alluvial floodplains, floodplains that flood, creating very nutrient-rich, very well-watered soil. It's a lot like the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile valleys kind of put together, I would say, if you're wanting to compare the environmental conditions between the Indus and other river valleys. River Valley civilizations, I mean. And the Harappan civilization is very mysterious. We know a lot less about the Harappan civilization or the Harappan Indus Valley people than we do about the Mesopotamian people and the Egyptians. And there's several reasons for why that is. The first and the biggest reason, I would argue, is we have not translated the Harappan language, known as the Indus script. It's a very mysterious language. We haven't found the kind of volume of inscriptions, epigraphs, or writing at these sites. We know they had a written language. We believe that these inscriptions are in fact language, a written language, but in order to translate a lost language from the past, linguists, philologists, scholars, they need to find a lot of examples of the language being used. And we haven't found that kind of volume of examples at the Indus Valley sites. It also is really helpful if documents or inscriptions in a known language are found alongside or nearby or attached to the language you're trying to decipher. That's how the Rosetta Stone was deciphered. The Rosetta Stone, of course, is a stone inscription that had Egyptian hieroglyphics and then a known language, Greek. And linguists and scholars and philologists, they used the Greek, a language they knew, to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, a language they didn't know. We'll talk about the Rosetta Stone in our Ancient Egypt lecture. Anyway, in terms of periodization, the Indus Valley civilization gets going about 3300 BCE, so a little bit later than the Mesopotamian civilization, and it lasts till about 1300 BCE, but it's really at its greatest power in what is called its mature phase, the mature Harappan phase, and that's 2600 to 1900 BCE. That's when the Indus Valley cities were at their peak in terms of their power, in terms of their culture, etc. And the image on this slide, of course, is a map of where the Indus Valley civilizations were, and this is a shot of Mohenjo-daro. And the last thing I'll say before we move on, another reason we don't know as much about the Harappan civilization is because their culture was very distinct, and it had a very distinct end. After the 1300s or so BCE, the Harappan culture is replaced by a different culture that comes into the Indus Valley region. With the Mesopotamian civilizations, there's a lot of continuity between the Sumerian peoples, the Akkadian peoples, and later Mesopotamian peoples like the Babylonians and the Assyrians. There's very similar art between those early civilizations and the later civilizations. The early civilizations like the Sumerians are using cuneiform. Later civilizations like the Babylonians and Assyrians are using cuneiform. But with the Harappan civilization of the Indus River Valley, it's the Harappan culture, and then it's a totally different culture coming in later on. So we can't really use comparative ethnography to study the Harappan civilization, at least not as well as we could for like the Mesopotamian people, because there's not the same cultural continuity. Here's a close-up of Mohenjo-daro. You'll notice they're primarily building their buildings out of brick. What's interesting is these bricks are actually fired brick. They've been cooked in an oven called a kiln. And of course a kiln allows these bricks to be a lot stronger. They can better withstand flooding. And of course they leave a lot more of a trace in the archaeological record than a mud brick does. Mud bricks break down. As they break down, they create tells, which are basically mounds. But the bricks from Mohenjo-daro are in much better condition because they were fired. You can see much more traces of buildings at these Harappan sites than you would see at like a Mesopotamian site. Now the Harappans used some mud bricks as well, probably for cheaper buildings, but the fact that they're using fired bricks is a good thing. It leaves a lot more for archaeologists to find and to study. This round building here, it's nowadays it's believed to be not original to the Harappan civilization. It was built much later. It's a Buddhist stupa or Buddhist religious building, and so it was built well over 1,000 years after the Harappan civilization had come and gone. Some more important details about Mohenjo-daro's buildings. They're made of fired brick primarily, with some mud brick as well. Bitumen is used as a sealant. So it's a very sophisticated construction being used by the Indus Valley people. The cities are set up on a grid pattern. You can see here there's grids for where the roads go. These are not just built haphazardly. It shows a level of sophistication and urban planning is going into these sites. And in terms of amenities, there's wells, many wells, even for small private homes, very sophisticated drainage systems to prevent flooding, bathrooms in houses. Basically, they're having water sources in their houses. And there's even we think we found a hypocaust, basically a heater, was found in one of the grander buildings. And so it really shows a high level of sophistication for this civilization at this point in history. Other features, fortifications, they don't really have complete walls around Mohenjo-daro, but there are watchtowers. So they were certainly concerned about maybe enemies coming in, but not overly concerned. They weren't building walls all the way around their city. Some of the other Indus Valley communities are more fortified than Mohenjo-daro was. And there are elements of monumental architecture, that is, large buildings that are built for community use. Certainly, their Great Bath, one of the most famous Harappan buildings, would count as a piece of monumental architecture. There are halls, and there is what is called the college. It's not a college in the modern sense like a university. It was probably actually a training center, probably for priests. In these early civilizations, priests were not just religious figures, they were administrative figures as well. So they probably received their religious and administrative training in the college. There's also a building that's thought to be a granary as well, although some people will debate whether it is actually a granary or not. And this is the Buddhist stupa that I mentioned on the previous slide. It's not original to the Harappan civilization. It was added much later. And there's definitely evidence of social stratification at Mohenjo-daro. But on the whole, I would argue this civilization is somewhat more egalitarian than like other early river valley civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia. There definitely were haves and have-nots in Mohenjo-daro, but the gap between the rich and the poor seems to be lower. You don't have these massive ziggurats being built. You don't have massive tombs being built, large palaces. There are some public buildings that certainly would have been costly to build, and there are nicer private buildings, and there's less nice private buildings. But it's not as you could say unequal of a society, as stratified of a society as like Mesopotamia, for example. But there is some social stratification, which of course is a prerequisite for having a city, according to V. Gordon Child. This is the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, probably the most famous building at this site. It's a large pool, almost 40 feet long, over 20 feet wide, and almost 8 feet deep. And the question is, was it built as a public bathhouse, like later Roman public bathhouses, or was this pool used as a ritual purification site, a place you'd go to clean oneself before going to do religious rituals? We don't exactly know because we haven't deciphered the Indus Valley language. But there were probably other buildings around the pool, probably some colonnades and outbuildings that would have been used by visitors to the pool. And you can see it's made of brick, and they would have used bitumen to basically seal the brick to prevent the pool from leaking. So we've talked about the city of Mohenjo-daro. Now let's talk about some of the small material culture. Some people consider buildings to be a form of large, grand material culture. Now we'll talk about like small material culture that would have been owned by private individuals. So you don't find like large statues at Mohenjo-daro. I think once again it's a more egalitarian society. You don't see these massive, expensive building projects to honor the elite. They do have some larger and more expensive buildings, but they don't have like massive ziggurats and massive tombs and things like that. What you do find are a lot of small figurines that are in private homes. These are probably owned by the families that lived in these homes, and we don't think they were just art for art's sake. We think that these figurines were supposed to represent deities, and they may be what are called cult objects. Now, I'm not using the term cult in the modern sense, like a cult is in you leave your family and you start wearing strange clothes and you try to recruit other people into the cult. I mean cult is in a religion with very specific rituals. That's more the definition of cult we use in like history and archaeology. And the images on this slide, at left and center, it's the bronze dancing girl piece. It was made sometime between 2300 and 1750 BCE. It's almost 5 inches tall and about 2 inches wide. It's a very interesting piece. The expression on her face, her posture with one hand on the hip. She doesn't seem to be wearing any clothing besides some jewelry. She has a very interesting hairstyle. It could represent a young woman dancing, or it could represent a female deity. We don't know for sure, but it certainly would have been an important object to the people who lived in Mohenjo-daro. And the piece is held in the National Museum of India, New Delhi. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, this is the priest king figurine. It's made out of a type of fired stone, and it was made sometime between 2000 and 1900 BCE. It's almost 7 inches tall and almost 5 inches wide. It's actually held in the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi. Once again, both Pakistani and Indian people can claim to be stakeholders of the Mohenjo-daro site. And this priest king figure may be a god of some kind, or it may represent a ruler of Mohenjo-daro. It could be that priests ruled Mohenjo-daro. They were not just religious leaders, they were also civil leaders, which is not uncommon at all. It's very common in these ancient civilizations. Here are a couple more examples of Harappan material culture. I think these are examples of trade goods, actually. We know that the Harappan people practice agriculture. We also believe they practiced metallurgy, that they could make things by melting down metals. And we also think they could make ceramics, and they engaged in trade, probably even foreign trade, beyond the Indus Valley region. And we know that they made things like beads, and we know they made pottery and figurines. We also know they had a standardized system of weights and measures for trade purposes, just to make sure that trade was as honest as possible, that nobody was being ripped off. So that shows, once again, laws in the Harappan civilization. And we also find these seals here, and these seals may have belonged to someone with power and authority, a priest or a king. Basically, it was their signature. And they have inscriptions that have yet to be deciphered. By looking at these artifacts, we also can infer that the Harappans were practicing animal husbandry. Livestock feature very prominently, especially on these seals. This is a seal of a bull. We also can infer that they had knowledge of the wheel. This figurine toy has wheels attached, so they knew about wheels. We also can infer that they traveled by boat. Many civilizations, especially those in river valleys like the Nile, like the Tigris and Euphrates, like the Indus, the easiest way to travel is by water. It's not by a wagon with wheels. The early wheels are so primitive, they're difficult to use, whereas a boat, much simpler to use. You can load it with a lot more cargo. And we think that the Harappans were traveling not just up and down the Indus River, but possibly traveling out into the ocean, perhaps going as far as the Persian Gulf. And some more direct information about the images on this slide. This is a piece of Harappan pottery. It's from between 2600 and 2450 BC. It's at a art museum in Los Angeles. These are beads of carnelian and terracotta, 2600 to 1900 BC in the British Museum. This is a bowl seal with an inscription about 2000 or 2010 BCE in the Cleveland Museum of Art. And this is a boat depicting what we think are birds that were used to help them basically navigate. The birds would fly back and forth between the boat and land. That way they would know which way land was in case their ship got turned around. And it's held in the National Museum of India in New Delhi. And this is a toy featuring wheels, and it's a ram and bird hybrid. And it's at a museum in Paris. And here are some more shots of Mohenjo-daro, the foundation of what is left of the settlement, combined with, these are artists' representations of what Mohenjo-daro may have looked like when it was inhabited by humans. You'll see very sophisticated drainage systems, fired bricks. These things were things that were very advanced about the city of Mohenjo-daro. Here are an artist's reconstructions of what Indus Valley people might have looked like. You can see their standardized system of weights and measures for trade purposes. They even have the man measuring the goods. He's dressed kind of like the priest king was dressed, that priest king figurine. So they're using artifacts to try to recreate what these people of this long lost civilization may have looked like. Now we'll talk about the end of the Indus Valley Harappan civilization, specifically the end of Mohenjo-daro. About 1900 BCE, there's evidence to believe that the people of these cities began to leave. They were not just leaving Mohenjo-daro, they were leaving other Harappan cities. And the cities were falling into disrepair as they were being abandoned and fewer people were living in them. We don't exactly know why, again, because we haven't translated their language. But we have several theories. It could be things like climate change. We think that one of the other rivers besides the Indus may have dried up in this period and there was not enough water. It could have been environmental degradation. The people may have cut down too many trees, too much deforestation. Livestock may have overgrazed, eaten too much of the grasses. They could have also not rotated their crops properly, and the soil ran out of nutrients. There's a lot of advantages to an agricultural lifestyle, but there's also some disadvantages as well. It could have also been flooding. Flooding seems to have been a problem in the region, and it also could be that there was an invasion of another culture, an Indo-European people known as the Aryans, and that's an academic term that I'm using, which I'll explain the meaning of the term Aryan in a future video. I'm using it in the academic sense here. And the Indo-Aryan people who founded what is called the Vedic culture, or they helped to found the Vedic culture, they use a different language. They use a language called Sanskrit. And we know Sanskrit. Sanskrit has been deciphered. It's still used. And they talk about violence and warfare in their epic poetry. So for many years it was thought that this more warlike Indo-European culture, the Aryans, came in and basically destroyed the Harappan civilization. And there's skeletal remains of people who were not buried properly, who probably died violently, or at least did not die from natural causes. have been found at Mohenjo-daro, as you can see on this slide. Bodies just in the road. And it was thought that they were killed by invaders. But now we think that they may not have been killed by invaders. It seems actually that there was a lot of internal strife before the Indo-Aryan invasion. And basically, what was left of the residents of Mohenjo-daro, they just didn't have the means to properly bury people. Their bodies were just left behind because the people who were living there were having so much trouble in other ways. In fact, we would actually probably say that Mohenjo-daro and other settlements were probably already abandoned by the time the Indo-Aryan people came in to the region. So, in summation, the Indus Valley civilizations, especially the city of Mohenjo-daro, very sophisticated but very mysterious civilization. Some major similarities with other river valley civilizations like the Mesopotamians, but also some big differences as well. We know a lot about the Mesopotamians because we have their language deciphered, and we also, there's cultural continuities between the Mesopotamian civilizations early on and the later Mesopotamian civilizations. With the Harappan Indus Valley civilizations, we don't know their language, and their culture just seems to have died out, and the areas where they once lived were occupied by other very different cultures. But now we'll move on to our conclusion for this video. Conclusion. The first settlements or civilizations in the ancient Near East developed after the adoption of agriculture at the end of the Neolithic period. Neolithic, of course, means New Stone Age. Some of these early settlements were Jericho and Çatalhöyük, and they bore some elements of cities. They had a decent-sized population close together, but they did not possess all 10 of the parameters of cities as identified by V. Gordon Childe. And indeed, there's many very large population centers or super towns that are not considered to be cities by Childe's reckoning. The first cities by Childe's definition, they emerge in Mesopotamia, a little bit to the south and east of where Jericho and Çatalhöyük were. And some of these important early cities in Mesopotamia were Uruk and Ur. Uruk in particular of the Sumerian people was one of the most important of these early cities, and it definitely possessed all 10 of Childe's parameters discussed earlier in this video. Uruk had resource surpluses, clear social stratification, divisions of labor, classes, a government, a religion, a written language, technological developments, and monumental agriculture. And Uruk's religious structures, which were basically temples built on mounds called tells, they'll evolve into the ziggurats of later Mesopotamian civilizations. There's strong cultural continuity between the Sumerian people of Mesopotamia and later Mesopotamian cultures. Later civilizations like the Akkadians and others that come after the Akkadians, they're going to expand the Sumerian cities, and they're going to establish new urban centers and eventually empires in the ancient Near East. And some of those empires, the later ones, will have contact and be trading partners and rivals of the classical Greek and Roman civilizations. But cities don't just develop in Mesopotamia. They're developing in places like the Nile River Valley, which we'll talk about in the next video. And also civilizations develop in the Indus River Valley, like Mohenjo-daro of the Harappan civilization, which had many similarities with other river valley cities, like the Mesopotamian cities, but also some pretty significant differences. And we just don't know as much about Mohenjo-daro and the Indus River Valley civilizations as we do about the Mesopotamians. We haven't deciphered the Indus River Valley script, and there's less cultural continuity between the Indus River Valley civilization and then later civilizations in the region.
But with that, we'll close this video, and in our next video, we're going to talk about the ancient Egyptians.